first episode of the Liverpool Stories Podcast by me, Dale Roberts. Now, I'm on Penny Lane, okay, and it has no bearing on what this podcast is about whatsoever. But if I had a title for this podcast, I'm going to call it The Journey to George's House. So it makes sense to do it from Penny Lane, and that gives us about 19 minutes to have a little chat. The whole idea and concept of this first episode is that it's probably best to be watched on video. So if you're watching it or listening to it, on Spotify or Apple or wherever you're listening to this podcast, just know that I'm going to try and be descriptive, but it has been set up, this podcast, with video in mind, and at least then you get to see the dog, okay? But equally, the dog's not going to speak, and if he does speak, then it'll be a very good podcast. But yeah, I'm calling this The Journey to George's House, and I know that many of you will have clicked on this just simply because of the title in and of itself on YouTube and on socials. But it has been a journey, to say the least. I'm asked quite often what I do for a living, and the easiest way to explain what I do for a living is I talk about the Beatles for a living. And that's the easiest way to explain what I do, because that is, in essence, the top and bottom of it. And that's what I've done for 9 years. But it hasn't always been as clear-cut as being a tour guide. Penny Lane, oh, it's right there. That's cool. I never intended or wanted to be a tour guide at all. But I became one, and I absolutely love doing it. I've been proud this year alone to take close to 14,000 people around the city talking about the Beatles in many different capacities as well, be that bus tours, bike tours, walking tours, excursion tours, private vehicle tours. I make a living talking about the Beatles, and it's a cool little job. Like, I'm driving along Penny Lane right now, and it's normal to me, like, and it's a cool thing. But before this podcast begins, I do want to say, of course, the usual things that people say on podcasts, which is, this is the first episode. So right now, I've got no one who's a dedicated subscriber or listener or follower or anything like that, apart from my own social media platforms. So please comment, engage, like, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. But I'm wanting this to be a podcast that really tells stories of people from Liverpool or people connected to Liverpool, and it makes sense that the first episode is probably my only opportunity to let people know who I am and what I do. So I'm going to go back here about 15 years for me in this journey, and I'm a huge Beatle fan. I became a Beatle fan by listening to an obscure John Lennon song called Dear Yoko, and I'm convinced I'm the only Beatle fan in the world who's ever become a Beatle fan by listening to Dear Yoko. But I became obsessed with the Beatles, obsessed with the life of John Lennon, and yeah, I've managed to be fortunate enough to be a Beatle fan who lives in Liverpool, who can make a living off talking about the Beatles and make a living from being in the industry. I started off as a Beatle fan, but I started writing. I used to be on social media, and I post about the Beatles on Twitter, and I became known as a guy who liked the Beatles. And then I started writing for a local website about tourism issues and about the Beatles, a website called The Guide Liverpool, which is a fantastic resource in the city, and a great team of people who shout positively about our city. And I always loved that, the positive angles of Liverpool. And the Beatles are the greatest band in history. They came from this city, and that is something I'm incredibly proud of. I was invited by a friend of mine called Steph to go to the Beatle Story anniversary. And I remember going to the Beatles Stories 25th anniversary party, and there was people there like Pete Best playing the drums on stage. There was Colin Hanton, who's the original drummer of the Quarrymen, and Len Gary, who was in the Quarrymen, and who is in the Quarrymen, I should say. The band's still going. And there was Alan Williams, who's the original manager of the Beatles, and there was John Lennon's sister, Julia Baird, and at that time I didn't know her, and it was nice to meet these people. And I was in the room, we had a great night, a great time. But then I'll never forget, I was outside the Beatles Story afterwards, and Alan Williams walked past, the original manager of the Beatles, and he said, "Bye lads, good to see you," and off he went. And I was like, "Bye Alan." I'd read all about Alan, I knew the stories of Alan, but he walked past, and I had no idea that would be the last time and the only time I'd ever meet Alan Williams. And he was renowned for sharing stories and telling his stories. And I've always felt quite sad that I never got to experience that and sit down with Alan and ask his stories from that time of the Merseybeat and such an exciting time in the city. Same with Bob Wooler, who passed away many years before. You know, Bob Wooler was a legend of the Merseybeat, but he passed away and the stories went with him. As I say, I'll never forget as well going back inside the Beatle story and asking them if there was any jobs going. So I joined the Beatle story, and it was just simply because I went on a night out and I enjoyed the place so much that I asked if there was any jobs going in my drunken state, and there was. And I started working for the Beatle story, and I was at the time working 5 different jobs at the same time, but eventually I would leave all the jobs and I'd just focus on the Beatle story and writing for the Guide Liverpool at the time. Writing about local tourism, I was working in the Beatle story, I was on the front line of it there meeting tourists. And the strangest thing happened though in 2016, which was that I got offered a job as head of marketing for the open top tour buses. So I became head of marketing for the open top red buses in the city, and one day I sat down with Philip Olivier, who owns the buses, and he asked me to design a Beatles tour. Now, looking back, that was a throwaway comment one day that, 9 times out of 10 probably wouldn't go anywhere, but I sat down and designed the concept of a Beatle tour. And then a few months later, Lee Jones joined the company, who's a friend of mine who's got a great background in tourism in Liverpool, and he trained me up as a guide, and he took the rest of the idea that had been set up and we ran with it. And then with Philip Olivier's sort of tenacious hard work and etiquette, the 3 of us sort of had this concept of a Beatle tour, and we ran it and put it out there. Couldn't get tour guides, so I started tour guiding, and this was by 2017, and by 2018 that tour was shortlisted for awards. I was up for Tourism Star of the Year at the Tourism Awards, and then the Cavern called me and said, we want you working for us. So I joined the Cavern Club. I was marketing executive for the Cavern Club. I was guiding on their Magical Mystery Tour as well. And one of the proudest moments for me in my short career in Liverpool, I was asked to do tours of the Cavern Club itself. And the Cavern Club in its entire history has never ran scheduled tours apart from for 2 years. And I was the tour guide who did those tours. So I'm very proud of that one. I've shown so many people around the Cavern Club over the years. But then, after the pandemic, which was a strange time where we ran virtual Beatle Week and things like that, after the pandemic, they asked me, they said, would you become manager of the Magical Mystery Tour? At the time, I'd just been accepted onto a master's degree, a Beatles master's degree in Liverpool. And I was kind of thinking, should I do this, should I not? And then the tour that I'd created, helped design for the red buses, it got named the best bus tour in the world. And I thought, okay, it was clear that my passion was in tours and talking about the Beatles. So it made sense that I became manager. So I became manager of the Magical Mystery Tour only for about 6 months. And then after 6 months, I decided it really was time for me to go out on my own and set up my own company. I bought into a company, didn't go well, so I set up my own tour company 18 months ago. In that time, the Magical Mystery Tour has been named the 8th best tour in the world. So it's the best tour in Liverpool at the moment. It's a fantastic tour that I still work on, and I still work for the Cavern Club. But I've had this long sort of 9-year career in the Beatles industry of Liverpool, in which I've met so many people and I've done so many things. And over the past 18 months, I've worked with incredible clients, including Liverpool Football Club, including Hollywood stars that I've done private tours for, and I still work for the Cavern, and I work with plenty of other companies in the city as well. So it made sense to get to the point where I set up a podcast to interview many people, especially people I work with, and interesting people that I meet on tours as well. But going back to the journey to George's house, it was a few years ago I met a lovely man called Ken, and Ken had bought George Harrison's house in Speke. He bought it about 2.5 years ago, so he got to work partially restoring the house back to its original condition, while equally making it a good enough standard for it to be an Airbnb. So he did that successfully, which is a great thing to do, by the way, because you've got to remember, we have 2 Beatles homes in the city that are National Trust houses that have been restored back to their original condition, but you can't stay in them. It's done in a very controlled way in which people do tours of the house with a custodian taking them around. But the concept of an Airbnb of a Beatles house is something that's not necessarily happened before. So he bought the house, partially restored it back to its original condition in terms of its living room and its decor, and he set up an Airbnb, and since then it's been quite successful. I've had a massive amount of people who've come on tours with me and told me that they are staying in George Harrison's house. Now, the journey for George to this house is that he actually was born in number 12 Arnold Grove in Wavertree, which is the house that typically people tend to go to when they do Beatle tours of Liverpool. A house that's recently had a blue plaque on the front of it, English Heritage blue plaque. But the house that George actually grew up in was number 25 Upton Green in Speke. The George Harrison family had waited for years to get into this house, that they'd been on the waiting list for many years, and then in the January of 1950 they moved into this new estate in Speke, and this would be the house that George Harrison learned how to play guitar in. It's the house where he had all of his memories in Liverpool, and he grew up in it, and it's the house that's full of history. And it's also, and I think quite important to say, it's one of very few Quarrymen and Beatle rehearsal spaces. John Lennon was banned from playing the guitar in his own house, but Paul McCartney's dad, Jim, would allow him to play in Paul McCartney's house, a house that's now considered to be one of the most important houses in the history of modern music. But George Harrison's house was another rehearsal space, because the Harrison family didn't mind George and his friends coming around to play guitar. So there's quite a lot of evidence that there was songs played there. There was potentially even songs written there. You know, when we consider In Spite of All the Danger, there's a good chance that part of it was written there, if not just the guitar solo. But Ken bought this house. He's ran it as an Airbnb, and then he contacted me about 4 to 5 months ago and asked if I would like any involvement with it. I'll be honest with you, at every turn of the way, I've expected the door to be sort of closed in my face with this one. I was very much expecting it, but the second he contacted me, and I'll be honest, I'm not rich. I'm a lad from North Liverpool, and I don't have lots of money. So when someone contacts and asks if I'd be interested in being an owner of George Harrison's house, it didn't even seem like something that was in my thoughts or dreams to sort of do. You know, it certainly wasn't the path I was expecting to take. But he asked me, and I thought I'd be mad not to pursue it. So I contacted a few friends of mine, most notably one of my good friends, Cal Mack, who's a fantastic musician in the city, and we really pursued this to sort of see if we could potentially buy the house, and it became evident that wasn't going to be something we could do. So I sat down with Ken. I say sat down. Ken lives in the United States and I live here. So we had many phone call conversations and many meetings, and eventually decided it'd be a good idea for me to come in as a director and a part owner of George Harrison's house. And I still can't get my head around even saying it, you know, that I'm now a part owner of George Harrison's house. But this is, right now, the first journey that I'm making to the George Harrison house in Speke, while I'm officially an owner, a part owner of the house. So for me, that's quite a special moment, and I thought this is a great idea for the first episode of the podcast, the journey to George's house, in as much as it gives me an opportunity to say why I've set up the podcast, why I do what I do, and also it gives me an opportunity to share the story of George. So we're going to make our way to the house. We're going to go there, we're going to go inside the house. I'll show us around just a little bit and tell us a little bit more about it. We're around the corner from the house. Now, you've got to remember, this area plays a huge part in the story of the Beatles in general, because Paul McCartney lived in Speke. He lived in many different houses in Liverpool, but he lived in Speke for a good period of time. And in 1947, this is maybe one of the most boring things I could ever dream of telling people, but in 1947 the Public Transport Act was passed through Parliament. No one ever cares about it, but it meant that public transport became quite a big deal socially within the city. So everyone was able to get the bus. Paul and George met for the first time getting the bus to Penny Lane from this area of Liverpool. They lived in the same neighbourhood, then they went to the same high school together. So they met on the bus route. George Harrison eventually on the bus route would play a song called Raunchy, which would get him into the Quarrymen. So that plays a huge part in the story. But I'm here, I'm pulling in. It's difficult to park my car here, but I'm going to get in. I'm in. Okay. And we're going to go over to George Harrison's house. And as I say, I've been here quite a few times. This isn't my first time visiting here, but this is the first time visiting as a part owner of the house, which is exciting. A proud moment, So, ironically, the sun's come out and it's blinding me. But this is the house. 25 Upton Green in Speke. And as I say, this is the house that George Harrison grew up in Liverpool. And he'd learn how to ride a bike, driving around this little street just here. I had the pleasure a little while ago, literally about 6 months back, of chatting to one of the neighbours, a guy called Jeff. And he was telling us stories about growing up with George in this little close in Liverpool. I also was here, only a week ago, with Ken and the gang, and when I was here with them, my son was here, Jude. He was given a scooter by Ken. Ken had this little scooter thing, and he was just scooting around the close, and I thought it was really cute watching it. But then as he came towards the house, I thought, this is going to be just a good photo in general. And I took a photo of Jude with the scooter, and in taking the photo, as I took it just naturally and normally, I realised I'd replicated what is one of the most iconic images of George Harrison as a child, which is that George stood here, probably in a very similar way as what happened to me just last week. His brother shouted him at the door to take a photo, and George was stood here with his guitar case, literally in this position just here. And this iconic image of George, which was then later used in the Now and Then music video that came out literally last year. So, yeah. There's history here. Okay, so this is George Harrison's house, and as I say, this is the house that he grew up in, where he lived. He lived in number 12 Arnold Grove. Then he moved here. Then he moved to Mackett's Lane for a little period of time, and his parents could never really enjoy that house because that's when all the Beatle fans started coming to the door quite often. But this is the house that I actually grew up in. This is where George Harrison lived. There's pictures of George in this living room with his guitars. So Ken's done a great job. Him and his wife, I believe, found the original wallpaper, a similar kind of wallpaper. So they could have it looking exactly the same, and then equally the same material of couch and same style. They also discovered recently Paul McCartney said about playing the piano around at the house. So Ken has managed to find a piano that's a very old piano, and have a piano in the house. I can't play piano. Of course, the house is a functioning Airbnb at the same time. So, for example, here, hidden away, I do have a television behind there. Capo for people who want to play Here Comes the Sun inside the house. But yeah, they do have a television. The kitchen's quite nice as well. This is an original. This is from the time when George lived here. Of course, the house is obviously going to change. You have people who've lived inside the house over the years and modernised and renovated it, understandably so. But there are some original features to the house. For example, the banister on the stairs has understandably changed over the years, and they've replaced the wood. They haven't replaced this part here. And I've explained this to a few people. This was a Beatle rehearsal space. John, Paul and George were all in the house playing music, and if any of them would have went to the upstairs toilet, they all would have touched this on the way up. So the hands that wrote every single Beatles song will have touched these. Now that is me being a Beatle nerd saying that, but it's true. You've still got the original bathtub up there. I came to this house, I've been to this house quite a few times before. The first time I came was only about, I don't know, a year ago. Probably around about 18 months ago, I don't know. But I came here and I sat with Ken, and I remember feeling like, wow, this is George Harrison's old living room. And he gave me the guitar and said, would like to play a song. And I love Bob Dylan, so I played If Not For You, which I think is one of the most beautiful songs that George covered, and it's a beautiful Bob Dylan song. But then I was back again about 6 months ago, and I sat here on this couch and we recorded In Spite of All the Danger, which is a song that I'm very pleased to say I covered a few years ago with my friend Mark Kenny and Dan Berriton as well. And it's now got like 1.5 million hits on Spotify, so I'm very proud of. But we recorded In Spite of All the Danger, but then I came here and sat here again on this couch with the guitar and recorded In Spite of All the Danger, which is on the YouTube channel already. But the person who recorded it was Toya, who's my friend from Brazil, and she's the person who's recording this podcast as well right now, so thank you very much, Toya. If not for you, winter would hold no spring. I couldn't hear the robins sing. I'd be sad and blue if not for you. If not for you, my sky would fall, rain would gather too. Without your love, I'd be no one at all. I'd be lost if not for you. If not for you. Okay, so I think that wraps up the episode here. And as I say, it's been a journey to George's house, not only right now for the podcast, but for me personally to get to this specific moment where I'm sat in the house as a part owner. Obviously I couldn't have got here if it wasn't for Ken, who bought the house and does all the hard work behind it. You know, for me, I've bought into something here that is already a fantastic product, and it's thanks to him in many ways. I certainly wouldn't have got to this point if it wasn't for my friend Cal Mack, who's encouraged all the way. And truthfully, I probably would have given up in working in this industry many years ago if it wasn't for the many people who've helped me out over the years as well. So the Liverpool Stories Podcast needs to be something that tells the stories of the people in Liverpool, of Liverpool, people connected to Liverpool. I'm quite excited for what is to come, but what I need is for people to listen to it, to watch it, to engage with it, to subscribe, obviously, and to also let me know what you want to see, what you want to hear on this podcast, who you'd like to have in as a guest. You know, I think naturally when people sit down on this couch, they're obviously going to start talking about the Beatles, they're going to start talking about George Harrison, but it's not all going to be Beatles. You know, Liverpool's a great city. I've said to many people over the years, people think the Beatles made Liverpool. It's not the case. Liverpool made the Beatles. George Harrison was a product of Speke here in Liverpool. He was a Liverpool lad, you know, post-war Britain, you know, lads growing up in Liverpool who go on to change the world. And that's the story that I'm wanting to share on this podcast. So let me know who you'd like to have on as a guest. Thanks for listening. And this has been a brief podcast episode. I think it will be after edit. But keep an eye out for more. There'll be more episodes coming very soon, especially in the new year.